Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Paul Farber. I'm Scholar in Residence at the Mural Arts Program, and along with co-organizer Daniel Tucker of Mural College of Art and Design, we welcome you to day 2 of In, Out. This is the first of hopefully a series of annual symposia put on by our host organizations, the City of Philadelphia Mural Arts Program and Moore College of Art and Design. We want to make sure to thank our hosts at Moore and all of the staff at Mural Arts for helping make this 2-day symposium happen. A special recognition also to the graduate students at Moore, who've also been an integral part of today and you'll hear from throughout this morning and afternoon. For those of you who were here yesterday, we started our discussion of this concept of time. Time as part of an artistic practice, time as a finite resource, as a conceptual frame, and one that artists and organizers and intellectuals and activists use in ways that can be complementary, and other ways that even when there are challenges, translating across time can be quite productive. We were joined by Rick Lowe for Keynote yesterday, and many of us went around the city to various sites that either utilize time or have to work against the forces of time. And so we also want to recognize graciously Neighborhood Time Exchange, Village of Arts and Humanities, and Asian Arts Initiative for being a part of yesterday's foray. While we were out in the field, we've come back, and we're glad that you have as well. This morning, we'll have a morning keynote, followed by a panel and then lunch. And in order to kick off the day properly and to introduce our keynote speaker, welcome up Moore graduate student Debbie Gibson.
Whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. Organizers and activists dedicate their lives to creating and envisioning another world, or many other worlds. So what better venue for organizers to explore their work than science fiction stories? Good morning, my name is Debbie Gibson, and I'm here as part of Moore's newest master's program, Social Engagement, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the author of those words. Walidah Imarisha, who is not only a writer, but also an organizer, educator, spoken word artist, and filmmaker. Walidah has taught in Portland State University's Black Studies Department, Oregon State University Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Department, and Southern New Hampshire's University English Department. She is the respected scholar behind the statement, "Why aren't there more black people in Oregon?" Walidah travels all over the world to teach about our past and how it directly relates to our present. And we're thrilled that she traveled here to Philadelphia to be with us on today. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you one half of the poetic duo, Good Sister, Bad Sister, Walidah Imarisha.
How's everyone doing? I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to set my little timer because I can go off on tangents, you guys. So first I want to thank Paul and Daniel for their hard work putting this symposium together and bringing us all here. So can we give a hand to Paul? So as you heard, I am the co-editor with my co-editor, I just said co-editor twice, Adrienne Marie Brown of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. We just got done with a 3-month tour where we did 47 events in 22 cities. So speaking of the title of this, talk about time, pacing, and perspective. We got a lot of all of that. So just a little bit of basics about Octavia's Brood. It is and has been a 5-year heart project, as we like to call it, for Adrienne and myself and 23 contributors. It came out April 2015 on AK Press in conjunction with the Institute for Anarchist Studies. It includes 20 science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, fantastical stories by organizers, activists, and change makers. It also includes 2 essays, one of them by Black horror writer Tanana Reeve Dew, an essay about the Black feminist science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who I will talk about a lot more in a minute, and an essay about Star Wars and imperialism by political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, which is amazing, you guys. I'm not going to get to play all of it for you, but we actually were honored to get an audio commentary of Mumia reading it, so I've excerpted that for something that comes, so you just get the littlest taste. But you guys, he does the Darth Vader voice. Yeah, Jamal does the Darth Vader voice. When I got the file, I almost fell off my chair. I went, what just happened? My life just got perfect. So these stories in Octavia's Brood cover so many different social issues, from environmentalism, war, capitalism, corporate control, immigration, criminal justice, gender, sexual identity, race, so many others around power and privilege. And to just give you, this is our table of contents. So just to pull out a few stories so you get how amazing this is and why I'm so glad I spent the last 5 years of my life doing it. We have a story set in a internment camp about a zombie apocalypse. That's Balfi's Revolution Shuffle. We have a story about a monster in Detroit, and it is a narrative around gentrification, which is Adrienne Marie Brown's The River. We have a radio script that is about a fictional meeting between Fred Sanford from Sanford and Son and Sun Ra, the black Afrofuturist musician, called Sanford and Son, get it, by Dualu Jabari Anderson. We have an exploration of alternative justice systems set in a matriarchal Afrofuturist society by Kalamu Yasalam. We have an excerpt from the amazing book Fire on the Mountain, which came out in the 1980s, written by Terry Bisson, that starts with the premise, what if John Brown's rebellion against slavery had been successful? Bam. That's all you need to know. We also, this is my little brag moment. We also, you might notice, someone's name is on this list. It's LeVar Burton. There it is. I keep being like, I'm gonna not do that. Like, I'm gonna become a professional and just be like, yes, we worked with the amazing, writer and actor and director and visionary LeVar Burton. And every time I'm like, you guys. So he wrote a book called Aftermath, which not a lot of folks have read, but is amazing. And he allowed us to excerpt it for this project. And the premise is it takes place in the future. There's been more environmental damage. And folks, the sun, the ozone layer is almost completely deteriorated, so folks are getting skin cancer a lot. And so white folks are actually grafting onto their body skin from people of color to be able to protect themselves. I was like, the barber brings it, y'all. So, and so many more. I could go through every single one, but I can't go through every single one. But, so these, by and large, there are, I think, 3 folks who had written science fiction before, but the vast majority of folks we reached out to had never written science fiction. They'd never even written fiction. And so when we sent the initial emails to folks, we got a lot of responses that were like, hey, thanks for the email. I think you might have sent it to the wrong Leah in your email address book, because I don't do this. And we were like, no, that's why we want you. And folks were really reticent at first to do this. And, you know, it's kind of like when you ask someone out on a first date, you're like, don't answer me right away. When you see them being like, well, you're like, no, don't answer. Just think about it. So overwhelmingly, when we went back to folks a few weeks later, not only had they come up with amazing, fantastical ideas, they had begun writing them already, and folks had 10, 20, in one case 70 pages of a story already written, right? And we were not shocked by this, because we know, as was said in the amazing introduction by Debbie, and thank you for that, we know that actually all organizing is science fiction. And all organizers are holding these fantastical new visions of new worlds inside of them, and they just need the smallest permission to let them out, right? That again, every time we try to imagine a world without these social ills we fight against every single day, we are engaging in science fiction. Those worlds do not exist. But being able to collectively come together and envision those worlds means that we can actually begin to pull them out of the dream world and into reality, right? We can't build something that we can't imagine. And so we absolutely recognize and think again that all organizing is science fiction, and all organizers are science fiction creators. We believe so strongly that organizing needs this idea of science fiction and visionary fiction, right? We often are very good at critique. We're often very good at, you know, at the break it down, and I love a good break it down, right? You know, the break it down. But once it's broken down, right, what do we replace it with? We need genres that allow us to step outside of what we're told is possible, what is real, right? Because I think it's incredibly important to note that all deep, substantive social change was considered utterly impossible at the time when people were making it, right? It was considered to be fantasy. Why are you wasting your time on this fantasy? You need to deal with reality. The best you can hope for is a little bit of reform, right? And folks rejected that, and that's why we have advances. So we have to continue that. We have to continue starting with the impossible instead of starting with the idea of what is a realistic win, right? I think, you know, conversely, I think that art needs organizing and this framework of justice as well, right? Because all art is political, as we know that. And if you're not conscious of what politics you're reproducing, then you're probably reproducing the dominant paradigm, right? And, you know, just to be clear, I don't think that, you know, art is connected to organizing, is connected to science fiction. I think that they're one and the same, right? That they are absolutely inextricable from each other. So oppressed communities of color, right, or all oppressed communities, especially communities of color, would not have survived without art, right, without something that protected our hearts when the entire world sought to destroy it. We would not have survived without vision, without science fiction, without being able to imagine a different world, right? And we would not have survived without the ability to organize, to bring those dreams out of the dream world and into reality, right? So we've got the heart, the head, and the mind. That makes a complete body, a complete person, right? So again, I think that these are all one and the same. Now, I'm using the term science fiction. I also know a lot of science fiction is dominated by the same mainstream paradigms, right? I mean, Star Trek, when it first aired in 1966, was advertised as a wagon train to the stars for a reason, right? Science fiction often is just a Western in space, right? We're colonizing new frontiers, we're dealing with these hostile, savage aliens, right? And you're like, oh, this is gonna be bad. So we wanted to come up with a term that separated out, you know, what we do from that. And we also wanted to come up with a term that, you know, God bless my nerds, but that we didn't have to have these conversations every single time that start off, well, I mean, is this technically science fiction? Because I don't know that there's enough science to justify that term. It might be speculative fiction, definitely magical realism, with a little bit of horror, perhaps alternative timeline, but not science fiction. I'm like, I love you so much, be quiet! So we came up with a bucket term, visionary fiction, right? We consider visionary fiction to be fantastical writings that allow us to challenge existing power structures and envision new just worlds. So I have some of the principles up here. Again, that it explores current social issues through the lens of sci-fi, speculative fiction, fantasy, horror. Basically, if it's weird, it's us, right? That visionary fiction is conscious of identity and intersecting identities, right? There's an amazing story in our collection, Hollow by Mia Mingus, and it looks at a future where folks who are dealing with disability and ability issues, that there's a war between folks who are called the perfects, right, who are normatively abled folks, and folks who are called the unperfect, right, who are differently abled. And basically, the perfects try to eradicate the unperfects, right? And they fight, and the unperfects fight back. And so, to solve that, basically the perfects send the unperfects to this rock in outer space, right, to an asteroid, and they're like, you can go there and die on your own. And instead, what the unperfects do is build this amazing world that centers them, right, that actually meets every single person's needs, because they are, they're centering those folks who have been marginalized. And that's another one of the important key pieces of visionary fiction, is that we center those folks who have been marginalized, right? That Leah Lakshmi Yapsna Samarasinha's story, Children Who Fly, is about trauma survivors, especially sexual abuse survivors, who are able to disassociate, right? And we're told disassociation is a bad thing, right? It's a result of trauma. It's something you go to therapy to get rid of, right? And instead, in a post-apocalyptic landscape, their ability to dissociate is the only thing that can save the world, right? Because they leave their bodies, come together, and that collectively their energy can heal the world, right? I'm like, yeah, that's centering people who have been marginalized, and being like, yeah, the leadership is gonna come from folks who are dealing with stuff that we're told makes them damaged, but actually makes them powerful. So it's conscious of power inequalities, right? Power inequalities exist now, they will exist into the future until we do something to change it. So we actually don't talk about dystopias or utopias. We don't think those are really useful languages in this, because there's no true utopia, there's no true perfect society, as long as there's human beings in it, right? Because we're messy, y'all, we're messy. But we also think, conversely, there's no true dystopia, as long as there's one human being who can imagine a different world, who has hope enough to believe something different is possible, right? So that goes to the point of it being, visionary fiction is realistic and hard, right? It's not utopian, but it's hopeful. At the end, the idea is that change is possible. And change is possible if it happens from the bottom up, if it's collective, if it's decentralized, and if it's within the context of a history of resistance. And lastly, visionary fiction is not neutral and doesn't purport to be. Our goal is to create social change. And so I want to share with you a few ways that we've been doing this in practice, because we have the anthology, which is amazing, but Adrian and I were both very clear. We wanted not just to give this to folks and have them read other folks' kind of visionary fiction. We wanted to create spaces for our movements to engage in visionary fiction itself. So one of the things, and we have many different ways of doing this, I'm just going to highlight a few. One of the ways is an Octavia Butler emergent strategy session that Adrian originally created. And so I was like, Adrian Butler, that would be awesome. Octavia Butler, again, was a Black feminist science fiction writer who we believe really embodied a lot of those visionary fiction principles, immensely and immaculately. And also the visionary fiction principles, when you actually look at them, you're like, oh, these are also principles of good organizing, right? Oh. So Adrian developed workshops where we take Octavia Butler's work, read it collectively, and say, what lessons can we learn from this for our movements for social justice? What strategies can we pull out of Octavia's work to be able to move our new visions of new worlds forward? And I think one of the things that's amazing about this is that it really levels the playing field, right? I've definitely been in meetings where, you have that organizer who's like, I've been doing this for 50 years, and let me tell you, and you're like, oh, right? I want to hear this, but could you not do it like that? Instead, in one strategy session, I saw a 12-year-old be able to be like, respectfully, I don't agree with that analysis of what I read. This is actually what I thought when I read that part, and this is what I thought it meant. And I was like, that's amazing! And I actually agree with her. So I think it gives us, reading this idea, engaging with fiction allows people to feel like they actually have access, and they can actually bring their ideas rather than needing these activist credentials. So there are actually some resources I wanted to share with folks if you are interested in doing it. There's the Octavia Butler Emergent Strategy Strategic Reader that Adrian and Alexis Pauling-Gumbs, who also contributed, created, and you can download that online as a PDF. There's the Transformative Justice Strategic Sci-Fi Reader, and 3 out of the 4 people who created that contributed to Octavia's brood. And it really looks at the idea of how do we keep our communities safe and whole without prisons and police? And what are the science fiction, speculative fiction stories that can help lead us in that direction, right? Because certainly when you talk about abolishing prisons, abolishing police, folks are like, you are talking some weird sci-fi Mad Max stuff right now. And that's actually not the case. And lastly is this Emergent Strategy Handbook that Adrian created. So it actually shows you, if you want to do an emergent strategy session, the nuts and bolts. Here's how you set up. Here's what you might want to do. Here are some questions. So you can look at that online, and if you wanted to download it, you can get it for a nominal price. So just, we want these resources to be available for everyone, right? We don't want to be like, you can only do it when we're here. We're like, that would be awesome if people were running it and we weren't even there. In fact, one Octavia Butler Emergent Strategy session Adrian did in New Orleans resulted in that group continuing to meet and read other Octavia Butler books, and then they formed the Wild Seeds Collective, and they are an amazing collective of Black and brown, mostly queer, women and trans folks doing organizing work in the lineage and in honor of Octavia Butler. And I was like, wait, what? That was possible? What? This is amazing. So we do collective sci-fi writing and visioning workshops where we take a social justice issue, break folks into groups, and have them develop a world where they can explore that social justice issue. And all of our workshops are collective because we want folks to practice collectively ideating, right? Dreaming together. We often, kind of are told, come with your idea, and then we battle it out, right? No, this is the reason my idea is better than yours, right? Rather than saying yes to your idea, and how can we blend this with what I'm bringing as well? This workshop is kind of the funnest one ever. It's the Sci-Fi and Direct Action Organizing Workshop, and we take existing science fiction worlds like Harry Potter, Star Wars, Star Trek. Groups embody the oppressed peoples in those groups, and then they set an organizing goal and develop direct action tactics to achieve that goal. You guys, you have not lived until you've seen the House Elf Liberation Front in action, or until you see stormtroopers stage a work stoppage to stand in solidarity with the Rebel Alliance, or you see the fighting Uruk-hai from Lord of the Rings develop capoeira-style fighting techniques to battle their oppressor and slaver. It's amazing, so there's that. And lastly is a new project that myself and contributor Morgan Phillips are kind of beta testing right now. It's the People's Encyclopedia 2070. So this idea of really writing the future as historical fact. And it started when Ferguson was happening and I wanted to write something, and I ended up writing an entry in the People's Encyclopedia, the 2070 edition, for Ferguson, and saying, this Black youth-led movement came together, rejected respectability politics, organized themselves, joined with movements around the world, and here's how they changed everything, right? And it was so empowering to write my dreams as certainty, right? This already happened. And I think that in organizing movements, we really claim history. We go back and we reclaim it. And we say, this is what happened. This is the real story. And our goal is to claim the future with just as much certainty. We're not going to say, well, we hope this happens. We wish this might happen. Maybe this could happen. We're going to say, no, this is going to happen because it's already happened. It's happened. It'll happen again. We'll keep making it happen for as long as we need to. So that brings me to time travel, you guys. So I was so excited when Paul and Daniel invited me because I stopped listening after the word time when I heard the title because I was like, time travel! That's all I'm thinking about right now. So I have obviously been a nerd for a while. But a lot of the Octavius Groot stories, Octavius Groot stories deal with time in different ways. So I did a little remix. We have a bunch of interviews with different writers, and I wanted to show you the remixed version so you can hear them talk
So
about it.
my sci-fi story is the kind that I've wanted to read from Ethiopia for a long time. I hope it's the kind of thing that will inspire other Ethiopian writers and African writers to both reclaim history that's been buried, while at the same time imagining different futures. So I tried to do both in the story there. So it's inspired by this picture, which is the St. George's Church in Lalibela. And it kind of looks like a spaceport to me. So I reimagined this temple as a spaceport. And I reimagined the life of Lalibela. And he's a time traveler. And I talk about kind of how he time travels, how they had all these technological advancements like several centuries ago.
I have been thinking a lot about and trying to process an emotional reaction to the hunger strikes in Guantanamo and what it means to have been imprisoning people without charge, without reason for so long, and that they are, that if it's not freedom, I'm going to starve to death. And what that means, and I think that it's very hard for me to process that reality and that feeling so powerless around it. So in my mind, I have created an archipelago with Island Prison. What's happening with Guantanamo is that there is history and story that's untold, and that there is so much power in story and really long memory, and that my dad used to call the long memory the most dangerous idea in America. And that resonates with me around these current issues of if people knew the long memory, if they knew the full history, they would know that this is not okay and this is wrong. And so exploring that through a fictional fantasy world is where I'm going.
Basically a short story where it's, my granddaughter, who's also a psychic intuitive abuse survivor organizer, is living in the apocalypse in the flooded remains of the San Francisco Bay Area. And all these grandchildren of those of us who are doing somatics in 2013 have honed their psychic abilities and are using it to interact with and heal planetary systems.
That is the meaning of Star Wars. We were rebels. We are empire. And like all rebellious children, we were going through a phase. We're getting ready for adulthood after we sowed a few wild oats. Once grown, we put on our imperial uniform and bow to the empire. It is your destiny, right? Unless, from somewhere, maybe on the Enterprise, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
My story is about time travel through intellectual practice. It's do we time travel through our reading, through our writing, through our thinking? Are we actually receiving messages from and sending messages to people who lived in different generations through the way we use language?
So those are clips. All the other videos are online, so if you just go to YouTube and look up Octavius Groot, you can see each of them is 3 or 4 minutes. So, obviously folks dealing with time in many different ways. And I think it's not surprising that so many of the stories in Octavia's Brood are about time. I don't think it's surprising that, so much of science fiction and time are connected, right? Because time is the basis of all of our nightmares, as well as all of our dreams, right? That, the past is either coming back to haunt us or to save us. That the future is seen as monstrous and dystopic, or as, salvation and utopian. I think this idea, right, if we're talking about horror, the past, ghosts are really the past, right, working to ensure that they are remembered. And I think that the past and ghosts only become violent and dangerous and deadly when they are ignored, when they are erased, right, when their pain and what they suffered is denied. And we can see that in, amazing books like Toni Morrison's book Beloved, which, takes place after the end of slavery and focuses on a formerly enslaved black woman who is being haunted by the ghost of her child who she killed, right? She killed her child rather than allow her child to go back to slavery. And so she's being haunted by this ghost, but not in the way of like, I'm gonna rattle chains and throw things at you and knock things off the wall, right? She's being haunted in a way that she's like, I want to remember this past. I want this ghost to be here. We need to hold on to this. And other people are like, you might want to do something about that. She's like, I'm cool, thanks. Obviously, Toni Morrison wrote it more eloquently. But, I really want to talk about Alexis Pauline Gumbs, the last speaker, what she said, because her piece, Evidence, is this beautiful mix of poetry and like academic scholarship and fiction writing to explore, as she said, this idea of the ways that we use language, the ways we use intellect and scholarship and poetry to time travel, right? And really seeing language and art and culture themselves as time travelings, right? This other plane of existence where the boundaries that we're told exist between the past, the present, and the future are completely eradicated, right? That we can move seamlessly between them. And in Alexis's story, she talks about sending messages to the future, but also the future sending messages back to the past. And those messages having an impact on the past, right? So really asking the question, is it possible that the future is changing and reshaping the present, right? That the future is reaching backwards and actually changing the present to ensure that future happens. And so in traditional ways that we talk about time travel, that's impossible, right? Or the ways we talk about time. That can't happen. The future you can't go backwards in time. You can't go forwards in time. You exist in the present. Once you move past it, it's gone, right? And you especially can't go backwards in time, right? Physicists have been arguing about this forever, right? Can you time travel back in time? And it ranges from everything to be like, that's actually just impossible, to like, that's a really, really bad idea, right? That's kind of the range. The butterfly effect, where, from, it's also a scientific term, but Ray Bradbury's story, A Sound of Thunder, where people are paying to go back in time to Paleolithic time where there are dinosaurs, so they can hunt dinosaurs. Because I'm like, that's exactly what time travel would be used for, unfortunately. And this dude steps on a butterfly, and he's like, oh no, I stepped on a butterfly. And then he comes back to the present, and everything is different, right? Because he killed one butterfly. People are like, that is why you do not do time travel, because you will change the present inextricably. So I think there's a lot that's in that, but I want to let someone else tell you about it. My favorite comedian, Hari Kondabolu, if you don't know him, dear God, what are you waiting for? Find him, he's amazing, has this skit, and I just have a quick excerpt, and it's just the audio from his album.
I love Back to the Future, I love all time travel films, but I have one issue with all these movies, and that is the main character is told not to change the past, because the present will be forever altered. As if the present was so fucking great to begin with. But the whole time, Doc Brown's telling Marty, no, Marty, you can't change anything. The space-time continuum, your parents will never be, the flux capacitor will blow you. You can't change anything, Marty. But Doc, if we can prevent slavery, certainly we should prevent slavery. No, Marty, you can't prevent slavery. Absolutely not. If you prevent slavery, rock and roll won't exist, and jazz and blues. No, Marty, you can't prevent the genocide genocide of the Native Americans, because then rich white kids in New England can't play lacrosse. Right? You can't prevent the assassination of Martin Luther King because I want a day off. What don't you understand, Marty? Great Scott, I'm a racist, Marty. I'm a racist. I like how my impression of Doc Brown is. Doc Brown. You can't change the past because the present will be forever altered. And that's why people of color aren't allowed to go back in time.
You should get it out the rest of this. But so, I'm like, this is why this is problematic, right? Because it implies that this present is so wonderful when so many of us who are marginalized and oppressed and are dealing with centuries of trauma know that's not the case, and know that if we could go back and change that, that would actually be a great thing. So one of the folks who I think, explored time travel so poignantly is Octavia Butler. Again, who is an incredible Black feminist science fiction writer. She won the MacArthur Genius Award. She's a visionary intellectual. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2006. But she wrote a book called Kindred. And Kindred is about this quote-unquote sort of paradox of time travel. And so in it starts in 1976. And a Black woman, Dana, is suddenly pulled back in time to the antebellum period, into the slave period in this country. And she ends up saving a young white boy who she finds out is actually her ancestor. And so she ends up being yo-yoed in time, being pulled back into the antebellum period by this white boy who grows into a white man. And she finds out, actually, that he sexually assaults a Black woman, and that's how Dana's lineage happens, as unfortunately happened for so many of us who were enslaved in this country. And so she deals with the dilemma, her and her white husband, Kevin, who also ends up getting pulled back in time with her, dealing with the dilemma, do they stop this horrific act, this sexual assault, and erase Dana's lineage, or do they allow it to happen for the greater good, right? And Tanana Reeve Dew, again, a Black horror writer who knew Octavia personally and is amazing, wrote an incredibly moving essay, The Only Lasting Truth, the theme of change in the works of Octavia E. Butler for Octavia's Brood. And she wrote, Dana and Kevin say quite often that they can't change history. But the reader is left with the niggling notion that, well, actually, Dana could have changed history. She chose not to, right? And so, I think that was really powerful because I think that notion proves that the paradox of time travel is not in science or time itself. It's actually in human hearts and human actions, right? That's where the paradox became, because Dana could have changed time. She chose not to because she was having a paradox of the heart, right? I think also Octavia Butler in this, book is, showing us the ways that linear time is a complete fallacy. The fact that the past is pulling Dana back into it, right? That it is impacting her, that it actually changes her completely. I'm not giving it away, but, really talking about what was slavery like, especially gendered enslavement, what was the resistance to it, and how is that still very much connected to the present, right? And so it absolutely challenges this European Western notion of time, right? Again, that there's the past, the present, the future. They're separate little boxes. It moves in a linear fashion. You can't go backwards, right? The past is gone. The future is unknowable. All we have is the present. I think that that's actually really important to recognize. That's an amazing tool for social control, right? Linear time is an amazing tool for social control. Because if you tell people, well, the past can't help you, so you might as well forget about it. The future, you can't do anything about that anyway. So all you can do is live for the present. Just try and make it as, livable as you can. You eradicate people's thoughts that they actually can, I was like, own the future. No, I don't want to say own. That the future is theirs, right? And I also think it's important, like the notion of time as we have it, right? This notion of time as absolute, right? Like the clock moving, my clock ticking down right now. these really came about and were solidified with the advent of capitalism, right? Because how do you measure someone's wage by an hourly wage if an hour means nothing, right? If an hour means something different to me than to you. And I'm like, well, I worked an hour. People are like, that was 5 minutes. I was like, it was an hour to me, where's my check, right? So this commodification of time broken down into these, little, absolute pieces that can be sold and traded, right? That's about capitalism. That's not about reality. That's actually not the reality of time, because there have been a lot of brilliant scholars and thinkers. One of them, Rashida Phillips, who lives here in Philadelphia and wrote or edited the amazing collection Black Quantum Futurism, talks about the reality is for communities of color and for cultures of color, we've never perceived time like that. That time has never been linear, it's never been absolute, it has never flowed only in one direction. And the book is great, and Rashida's work in it is really powerful and showing, really analyzing and saying, let's look at a Khan society in Africa. Let's look at Yoruba society in Africa, and then in the Caribbean. How does time look there, right? And time is something completely different, right? That time is actually much more cyclical, that you can move backwards and forwards in time, that you base your understanding of the passage of time on events, not on a clock, right? Yesterday, let's talk about yesterday. Yesterday was important when I saw Rick Lowe speak. Not yesterday was important because at 11 a.m. this is what happened, right? Or 12 a.m. I don't know. I've so rejected time that I can't even remember it, right? But so this is what quantum physics is saying now, right? Quantum physics is like, you guys, did you know time is not absolute? That time actually is not linear. That time can exist infinitely in infinite places happening all at once. And like communities of color were like, yes, boo-boo, we knew that. We told you that. It's cool. That's fine. I mean, we've all done that, right? We've all experienced the way that time is not linear and absolute by going back to any place you had like substantial memories, right? Going back to any place you called home. And I'm experiencing that right now. I used to live in Philadelphia. I lived here for 8 years, 8 years ago. I'm walking around the streets and I'm seeing that time superimposed on this time, right? I'm seeing both of them. They're moving back and forth, that feeling of like, wait, which time am I in right now? I don't know what's happening. I expect to see like a 20-year-old me with like purple hair walking down the street, and I'd be like, you're awesome. She's like, you're a weirdo. But, that's dual time, right? That's nonlinear time. And the idea of like, well, that's just our perception of time, right? Given the name of the time, pacing, and perception, time is all about perception, right? This external clock is just something we've all agreed on, but it's also, we've agreed that it also doesn't mean anything, right? Because if time was absolute, we wouldn't have time zones, right? We wouldn't have daylight savings time. Time is absolute. It's 8 p.m. here, it should be 8 p.m. in Tokyo, right? If it's absolute. But that's not the way that it works, right? Because we don't want to have the sun rising at like midnight. So we all agree time is absolute, except in these specific instances that we won't talk about too much. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Star Trek, because dear God, I have to, because I love it. So my favorite Star Trek series is Deep Space Nine. It's a much maligned series. Thank you! Yes, thank you! So maligned. People are like, it's boring. I'm like, it's just, you're not smart enough. Sorry. So it takes place on a space station around, I'm not going to tell you the whole plot. I'm reining it in. So around this planet Bejor. And so the captain is Commander Ben Sisko when it starts. He becomes a captain later. And he's the first black captain. So as when I saw it in my, formative adolescence, I was like, oh my God, I love you and you haven't even talked yet. So in the first episode, The Emissary, he has to explain linear time to these aliens who live in a wormhole and therefore exist in every time simultaneously and don't understand the concept of linear time. They're like, how do you not know the past, the present, and the future all at once? And he's like, oh, what? This is a lot, right? And they're in his mind and they use his memories to communicate with him. And they keep going back to this moment that he has in his mind of seeing his wife right after she had died after a Borg attack, right? And they just keep bringing him back to that moment again and again and again. And they have this amazing dialogue. I couldn't find the clip, so I have to reenact it for y'all. So it's between Cisco and the wormhole alien / prophet. He's like, I don't know if you can understand. I see her like this every time I close my eyes. In the darkness, in the blink of an eye, I see her like this. None of your past experiences help prepare you for this consequence. And I have never learned how to live without her. So you choose to exist here? This is not linear. No, it's not linear. So good. I didn't do it justice. But you have to, Avery Brooks, who plays Cisco, so I'm like, he is such an amazing overactor in that scene, but it's so beautiful. But, so this is so amazing, because, first it shows how our emotions are non-linear, right? That we continually go back to places. But especially this idea of trauma, and having a black captain talk about trauma, and the ways that trauma pulls him back through time, right? That he is time traveling through trauma, was incredibly powerful to me as a young black person, right? And especially that his trauma was related to the death of a black woman, right? That she mattered so much, right? That it was also a source of his trauma. And I think that, the idea of the loss of black people in general, right? This is why we have Black Lives Matters, right? The loss of black people in general, the loss especially of black women and trans folks, to have that centered and to say, this is important. This is something you will not be forgotten, right? Say her name, right? His wife's name was Jennifer. So, I think was incredibly powerful for me as well. So I think, to be really clear, I think, again, heartbreak, trauma travels, right? We travel with it constantly, and not just individually, but collectively. And I certainly know that I have been having heartbreak time travel every single day that I look at the news, right? And I'm seeing the Charleston massacre, and I'm time traveling to 1850, and I'm time traveling to 1923 with the Rosewood massacre, which is an all-black town that was eradicated, and I'm traveling to the 1963 Birmingham church bombing. I'm seeing this video of Eric Garner having the life choked out of him by the arm of a white police officer, and I'm seeing it superimposed on bodies hanging from trees, right? That every time black folks look at a badge, we are seeing it superimposed with a hood, right? With a Klansman's robe. That this is collective trauma that is being forced on us. That the horror of American racism is not linear, right? And I think the other piece that's incredibly important about that is that we are not linear beings either. So our resistance doesn't have to be linear as well. That we can also time travel back to the resistance movements and pick those up and hold those. That we can embrace this notion of the past, future, present, right? My idea that the past is reaching into the future, and then the future is reaching back to us. That we're all connected and we're all flowing into one another, right? Because I think it's incredibly important to see those folks who came before us not as passive victims, but active change makers. And that especially for those of us from oppressed communities, from communities that have experienced historic trauma, to recognize we are walking science fiction. That someone dreamed us up at a time when they were told we would never exist. And then they bent the entire world. They re-envisioned reality to create us. And I think, for Adrienne and myself as two black women, we think about our enslaved black ancestors in chains, who had no reason to believe that an end to chattel slavery would ever happen in this country. Right? We're in fact being told every single day, this will never end. Slavery will exist forever. You better get used to it. Right? And they rejected that. They said, absolutely not. We reject that. We will have our freedom. We will have the freedom of those who come after us. And if necessary, we will change this entire world to get it. And that's exactly what they did, right? They time traveled into the future, right, for us. And they threw their visions and their dreams into the future for us. And so I think they claim this right and this responsibility and this immense privilege for us to continue dreaming. I think that sometimes we're told, oh, well, dreaming is frivolous, right? Stop daydreaming, focus. I think that dreaming is an incredibly serious business, right? And that, again, we have the right, we have the responsibility and the privilege to dream new futures. And then to do the hard, glorious work to build them into reality. So for us, you know, that's what visionary fiction is time traveling into those futures to try and catch pieces of them and pull them back here so that we're leaving ourselves breadcrumbs to be able to move towards that future. And to create a world where those who come after us will be like, can you imagine there was ever a time in this country where prisons existed? Where people just thought that was cool? And youth would be like, what? That's ridiculous. That never happened. And then they'll be like, yeah, and now we have to carry that legacy forward to end this new concern, this new issue that came forward, right? That we are part of this past, future, present, continuous, non-linear resistance movement, right? It's like a multi-dimensional, non-linear, something, I don't know, I'll think of that later. Transcontinental, no, that's not. Transplanetary, there we go. Resistance movement. So I think that one of the amazing things that is happening is movements are incorporating this idea of visioning the future. And so Black Lives Matters has started this incredible campaign where they are asking folks to submit responses to the prompt, in a world where Black Lives Matter, I imagine. And I think that is just so, again, powerful, that it is not just stop killing us. It is saying Black Lives Matter. And we will keep saying it, and we will keep dreaming it, and we will keep knowing it until everyone else knows it as well. And we will envision it and envision what it looks like on the ground so deeply that we will bring those visions to life. So thank you all so much. I want to... question and answer, which is why I skipped another amazing Deep Space Nine quote. So it was like a whole clip, but I was like, it's too long, it's 5 minutes, and it requires a big setup. But I can't assign you homework, but if you want it, please watch Far Beyond the Stars, Deep Space Nine episode from season 5. Far Beyond it is like the most visionary, non-linear, like it just takes everything I just said and pulled it together. And there's a line that is so poignant, that is said to Ben Sisko, to this black captain, that says, you are the dreamer and the dream, right? And I was like, whew. And he goes, this is ancient knowledge, right? And I was like, Ben Sisko, you are dropping this so hard right now. So please watch it, but if not, remember that you are the dreamer and the dream. So if anyone has questions.
All right. Yeah, we have one or two questions. Time for one or two questions, and I've got a mic which you should speak into for our recording and for our interpreters. Anyone?
First of all, obviously, thank you so much for your presentation and for being here. Couldn't help but notice the laughter during your introduction when the implication was made that Oregon has an overwhelming whiteness, which is a long-standing problem with Oregon, is that there is this erasure of racialized people, in particular black people. Curious if you could maybe talk about your work specifically in Portland and using history and fighting against that kind of erasure of the present and the future of Portland, and black Portland in particular, by erasing the history of the past.
Thank you. Again, I'll try and stay focused. So, even though a lot of people can't find Oregon on a map, God bless them, I was at a conference in New York, and I was like, yeah, I lived in Portland, Oregon, and someone was like, how's the Midwest? I was like, you teach at a university. I just hope you haven't had enough coffee. I actually think that Oregon is an incredibly useful case study for the rest of the nation, right? Because I think that the principles the ideologies, the practices that shaped Oregon, shaped every other state in the nation, shaped this country as a whole. But Oregon has always been just up in your face, blatant, like, I'm just going to tell you how it is, a lot in writing, and you're going to take it. So Oregon was actually founded as a white homeland. So the call went out, come to Oregon, right, during, before it became a state in the 1830s, 1840s, come to Oregon and build the kind of utopia that you dream of, right? And I think that Oregon can actually be seen as this sci-fi project and shows the dangers of utopia, right? This idea that we could create a perfect world. So Oregon was founded as a racist white utopia. It was to be this white haven where they could come and get away from the problems of the day, which meant people of color. So Oregon, stole all of the indigenous land and gave it away for free to white people, right? With the Oregon Donation Land Act in 1850. Oregon in 1844 actually passed its first racial exclusionary law that said that black people could not live in Oregon, and that if we were in Oregon, we would be publicly whipped every 6 months until we left, right? That was called the Lash Law. So Oregon made it illegal for black people to be in the state of Oregon, and that if we were there, we would be publicly brutalized and tortured until we left, right? Oregon is actually the only state in the Union that was admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. So in 1859, it banned black folks from living in Oregon, making contracts, or holding real estate. So in essence, black folks were the first undocumented people in Oregon. And I think that this is really important, right? We're having these conversations now around immigrant justice, around who is considered a citizen, around who can get access to basic human rights, about who is even considered human. And I think especially, for me and for other black folks, I feel like it's incredibly important to recognize, those conversations have been had about us as well. And so we need to stand in solidarity and recognize those connections historically. So, I think the other piece that's important about the racial exclusionary law is that it wasn't removed from the Constitution until 2001, right? And it was a fight to get it out. And that for over 100 years, black folks have been going to the legislature saying, take this out of the Constitution. And they actually had to take it to a ballot vote, let the people decide, and it passed by the slimmest of margins in 2001. So I think that, again, Oregon has been very blatant about things. So these same ideas have shaped the rest of the nation, but you can point to Oregon and be like, no, Oregon said, we don't want no black people here, right? Oregon said that up until 2001, and then only begrudgingly we're like, I guess you could say, whatever. And I think that this idea of, Portland, who's seen Portlandia? So this idea of Portlandia that's being exported around the country and that's bringing these flocks of, people who, white people want to relive the 90s over and over again, right? This idea of Portlandia is predicated on this racial exclusion, right? Portlandia is a white racist utopia, just as much as Oregon was a white racist utopia in 1844, right? And so they don't say, the language may be prettier, right? We like the 90s, right? It's not, we hate black people, we hate brown people, but the result is the same, right? So this kind of white racist utopia of Portlandia, those resources that make Portland such an amazing, livable city would not have been possible without, taking those resources away from communities of color, right? And there was a recent housing report that just came out, a month ago, that said that if you are black, if you are Latino, if you are indigenous, if you are immigrant, if you are working, if you're a single mom, you cannot afford to live in Portland. Across the board. You can't afford a studio, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a house. You cannot afford to live in Portland, right? And so for all of Portland's talk, we're so diverse, we're so liberal, it's still a white racist utopia. And there's still a ban on folks of color. It's just, been shifted a little bit, right? But the result is the same at the end of the day. It's the Portland Housing Bureau's most recent report. All right, sorry that I talked a lot about that. I was like, rein it in. I was like, and another thing.
We have time for one more short question. Okay, up front.
Imarisha Smith, I'm 67, and this sounds like the 60s all over again. Oakland, the Black Panthers, yes. Black Like Me, autobiography of Malcolm X, and we're doing it all over again. I just went up to Harlem, wonderful, wonderful. It's literature, it's arts will save us, it really will. And the Black Panthers, they help, you have to feed the people, educate them, and I love what you stand for. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have a question? Do you want to ask a question?
So I think at this point we should transition to our next activity, but let's give Walidah another